Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unit 2 lecture. Today we are going to be talking about all the different pieces that go into the materials for this week's unit, particularly about the Man-So chapter, but also some of the other things woven in. In this week, we are dealing with the colonies of Maryland and New Amsterdam, and also with religious folks, with Roman Catholics, Jesuits, Jews, Protestants also, but not featured as much this week, and the film, our first feature film, first full-length film, The Mission. So in the materials for this week, you are going to engage with a tangled story of European and American here understood broadly, North and South Central Americas. A tangled story of these, of the contact here between these peoples and the colonization that took place, the commerce, the trade, the profits, the losses, some of the disputes, and there are several, and a new concept for us of religious toleration. And so we are going to be encountering this concept here in Peter Man-So's chapter 4, Blasphemy, in One Nation Under Gods, where he talks about the founding of Maryland. He talks about a number of things, but one of the new historical aspects here is the founding of the colony of Maryland, which is distinct among all of these colonies that we've talked about so far. The province of Maryland was founded by an Englishman, George Calvert, and his son Cecil, who were the first and second barons of Baltimore. They were allowed to found this colony by King Charles I of England, who granted George Calvert the charter for a colony near Virginia, and King Charles named it after his Catholic queen, Henrietta Marie of France. So they named it Terra Mariae, or Mary's Land. So here, even in this short little snippet, we see the negotiations still going on in Europe, which went on for quite some time, between different Christianities, between Roman Catholics and Protestants, and the jockeying of power, the interplay of royal powers. We have intermarriage among royal families in Europe. Some are Protestant, some are Catholic, and it causes all kinds of interesting situations. So in 1634, the ships the Ark and the Dove set sail from England from Maryland by way of the West Indies. West Indies is another name of the Caribbean. Remember that 1630 was the year Governor Winthrop gave his City on a Hill sermon with the Puritans, the English Puritans, on board the Arabella just before disembarking and founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Lord Cecil Baltimore's instructions for the folks setting sail for this new colony required a peaceful coexistence between religious factions. This is something new. Here's a quotation from the instructions. His lordship requires his said governor and commissioners that in their voyage to Mary Land they be very careful to preserve unity and peace amongst all the passengers on shipboard, and that they suffer no scandal nor offence to be given to any of the Protestants, and that for that end they cause all acts of Roman Catholic religion to be done as privately as may be, and that they instruct all the Roman Catholics to be silent upon all occasions of discourse concerning matters of religion, and that the said governor and commissioners treat the Protestants with as much mildness and favor as justice will permit, and this is to be observed at land as well as at sea. So we see distinct instructions on how these different members of religious communities are to behave towards one another. So please note that Lord Baltimore's instructions and Governor John Winthrop's City on a Hill sermon are different. The Catholics in Maryland were not establishing a city on a hill. They were to practice their faith privately, out of sight of the Protestants. Yet, Man-So points out, as soon as the Catholics disembarked the Ark and the Dove, they promptly hewed a large cross out of Maryland trees, and they held an open-air mass. Nonetheless, all the disputes that were going on in Europe in the Reformation between Protestants and Catholics, this bloody, conflicted time, was solved in a way in Maryland, with Catholics mostly practicing privately and the Protestants looking the other way when they did not. Here is an image of a painting. It's not the best resolution, I'm sorry, but it's an image, an imagination in the 19th century of what it was like to found the colony of Maryland by these Catholic and Protestant settlers. And you'll see here, of course, the engagement of Europeans with native peoples. You see also over here a figure who is distinctly a priest, and not just a Roman Catholic priest, but in his black robe he is identified as a Jesuit, just like Fordham University, a Jesuit. And there are some elements over here of candles and a crucifix, and looks like some kind of covering for the Eucharist. Very distinctly Roman Catholic ritual elements over here. I believe this is to be a depiction of Father Andrew White, the Jesuit, the English Jesuit described in Manso. This painting was by Emanuel Leutze, The Settlement of Maryland by Lord Baltimore. And so, again, 19th century realist imagination of what took place in the 17th. So this painting invites us to take a look also. So you can see in this painting some distinctive figures and some indications of their status. You can see that these folks are wealthy. Their clothing is ornate. It looks like a significant amount of gold thread is embroidered into the fabric. They're very well dressed. They look very well fed. You can see this luxuriant covering over this table, and this luxuriant velvet drapery, carpets, and shoes. Everything looks very, very wealthy. And please note this figure over here to the left, this dark-skinned young boy, presumably an enslaved African, who is some kind of servant to these folks. So let's find out some more about this painting. It's a painting of Lord Baltimore II. His name was Cecil Calvert, and this is his grandson, also named Cecil, and it was painted in 1670. It was painted in London by the court painter to King Charles II. This Lord Baltimore never saw Maryland. While his son Charles was governor, Charles came to England for a visit in 1669 to 70, the time of the painting, and brought his family, including his young son. You notice here in Calvert's right hand, he holds a map of Maryland, published in 1635 to promote colonization plans. So there's some distinctive messaging going on in this painting, which is on view at the Maryland State House if you'd like to go see it in person. Here we have a historical marker looking back at the distinctive religious history of Maryland. This is a marker in St. Mary's City, which was the capital of the Maryland colony from 1634 to 1694. And it says, "Here, for the first time in America, men and women of differing faiths lived in peace and goodwill, practicing freedom of conscience, according to Lord Baltimore's Instructions to Colonists, 1633. That's the instructions that I read a quote from a moment ago. Free men assembled of various beliefs changed practice into law by approving in 1649 something called an Act Concerning Religion." And we're going to find out more about that in a moment. So in 1649, and this is going to be slightly covered up by the window of my face over here, I apologize, the Act Concerning Religion was passed. It's often referred to also as the Act of Toleration. And it protected in Maryland a variety of Christian sects, note just Christian ones, not Judaism, not Muslims, etc., etc. Protect a variety of Christian sects from persecution by government. In 1654, the demographic of the colony changed, and Protestants gained a majority in the colony. And with that majority, they issued a different Act Concerning Religion. And then this one, there was protection for a variety of Christian sects, except Roman Catholics. So just the different Protestant Christian sects, not Roman Catholics, not indigenous peoples, not Jews, not Muslims, etc. In 1658, Lord Baltimore resumes control and he reinstates the terms of the original 1649 Act concerning religion. Under the terms of the 1649 Act concerning religion, blasphemy was punishable by death. So I include this because Manso makes a point of this in his rendition of the story of Jacob Lombroso, the Portuguese Jew and physician who arrived in Maryland in 1656 via Brazil and was arrested and put to trial for blasphemy in 1658. He was acquitted. And I want to say that this story of Jacob Lombroso, I believe, I fancy that's included in Manso because Manso is going through documents here in America and he sees the trial records and he makes a note that for this particular figure who is clearly a Jew, a Spanish Jew, Sephardic Jew, who would have been Spanish or Portuguese, Sephardic Jew, would have been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492 or 1497, depending upon where, and probably his family may have made their way probably to North Africa. And he makes this conjecture because a number of the documents about Jacob Lombroso identify him as black. Not sure what it means by that, but some dark swarthy skin or dark-skinned or dark hair for sure. So let's take a look back again, back over to Europe, across back the Atlantic, to look at the expulsion of the Jews. And we're going to look at these different dates in which these different countries, these nations, kicked out the Jews. So in 1492, the famous year that Columbus set sail, that's marked here. But that's not the earliest year that we see an expulsion. We see Poland over here, Germany's in the 1100s, and England in 1290. So in 1492, Spain expelled all of the Jews from the kingdom, and in 1497, Portugal followed. It's a very famous expulsion because there were many, many Jews living on the Iberian Peninsula. And these Jews went to North Africa, as conjectured by Peter Manso, all the way across the Mediterranean to what is now Israel and Syria and places like that, up into what's the Ottoman Empire, over to Italy, and also you can notice to Brazil, which was Jacob Lombroso himself, and Portugal, from Portugal over to Holland, who's going to become a new player in our story this week. In 1290, this is the point about England expelling the Jews, and it took until 1657 for England to allow the resettlement of the Jews with Oliver Cromwell. So as I just mentioned, we have a new European colonial player in our story, and we have, you can see this is an engraving of the West Indies House, or the West India Company that was run by the Dutch. It's the Netherlands, Holland, Dutch, all of these are pointing to the same thing. And in 1609, so this is really right back at the beginning of the 17th century, as the commerce for the Dutch East India and the Dutch West India Company is starting to take off, the Dutch East India Company hired English sailor Henry Hudson to find a northeast passage to India. Why did they want to go to India? The spices, the luxury, the silk, all of the different luxury items and things that were becoming very, very popular in European trade. So Henry Hudson arrived. He didn't make it to India. He sailed across the Atlantic, and instead of finding India, he found Cape Cod. He arrived at the coast, and then he went up, and he sailed up the mouth of a big river. That river is now the Hudson River, just outside, a couple blocks away from me. Hudson got as far as present-day Albany. Then he sailed back to Europe, and he claimed the entire Hudson Valley for his Dutch employers. This is in 1609. In 1621, The Dutch West India Company, that's the company in the engraving I just showed you, was given the charter by the 7 republics of the Netherlands for a trade monopoly in the West Indies and jurisdiction over Dutch participation in the African slave trade in Brazil, Caribbean, and North America. A very powerful merchant company. Remember, John Winthrop gave his City on a Hill sermon on board the Arabella in 1630. That's still a number of years after the Dutch have made their way into North America. So this is another image here, not the best resolution again. This is an imagination of the purchase of Manhattan Island by the Dutchman Peter Manout in 1626 from the Lenape people. I am very interested in this story because I live in northern Manhattan, and they say, the legend is that this particular transaction between the Dutch and the Lenape took place right here in Inwood Hill Park, and there's a plaque at the Sherikapuk by the tree there, the tree stump, that commemorates this moment. So in 1624, I realized that my image is covering up some of this information. I'm moving my image, but I actually don't know that the video will reflect that. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company sent 30 families to North America, settling in what is now Manhattan. Their focus, these settlers, was not farmers. They were not into agriculture, but they were traders. They were engaging in the fur trade, which was a very lucrative trade. In 1626, this man, Director General Peter Manout, arrived in Manhattan and purchased Manhattan Island from the Lenape people for 60 guilders, and according to the plaque in my neighborhood, also some strings of beads. Okay, now I'm going to try to move myself back over. Again, I don't know if my image is changing or not on your video. So here we have another map. Here's a map of the European colonization on the Atlantic coast. You can see the yellow colonies are the English ones. This pink bit is the Dutch part. The green are the French colonies. And down here we have a little snippet of Spanish colonies, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But we're going to go through the rundown of the dates so you get a sense of what got settled by Europeans when. And what I like about this map is it includes a few of the names of the First Nation peoples who were living in these regions when the Europeans arrived. So in 1513, again, wow, this is a whole nother century prior to what we've been talking about, the Spanish settled in Florida. In 1534, New France, so then we have the French all the way up here in this green part, meeting the Huron. In Florida, the Spanish met the Creek peoples. In 1606, there's Virginia. There's that first English colony. 1620, Plymouth. Then we have 1623, New Hampshire, up in here. And then in 1624, New Netherlands. So that's Holland. This is this new area. There's this bit of New Sweden. We're not going to talk about it much. It didn't last as a colony very long. 1629, Massachusetts Bay Colony. There's Governor Winthrop's folks. 1634 is Maryland. 1636, we have Connecticut and Rhode Island and in New Haven. 1638 is that bit about New Sweden. 1663 is Carolina, the Carolinas. 1681, Pennsylvania. And 1732, Georgia. So this is a very interesting memorial plaque about the first cemetery of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, Shear Israel, in the city of New York. Note the opening date, 1656. Jews in New York. Jewish people in New York. I don't mean any disrespect when I say Jews. Please know that I am a former Jewish fellow here at Fordham University. 1647. Peter Stuyvesant, another Dutchman, he comes with one of the West Indies companies and expands the colony and its trade. if you know the Stuyvesant Town buildings way downtown around 14th Street, named after Peter Stuyvesant High School. As a result of this trade, Amsterdam grew rich. Capitalism was going full bore, and investors in Amsterdam grew very rich on this trade. In 1654, 23 to 27 Jews came up from Brazil, including Jacob Lombroso, to Stuyvesant's New Amsterdam, so just prior to the first synagogue. Stuyvesant didn't like this, and he protested to his employers, to the Dutch West India Company. But there was a bit of a problem with his protest. The company refused to let him expel the Jews. Why? Because the Dutch Jews in Amsterdam, those people who had been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, they had invested a large amount of capital in the company. And so these Jews here couldn't just be expelled like they were in Europe. Very interesting how this kind of influence begins to play. So this is a wonderful image of Lower Manhattan. I'm moving my image again, but I don't know if the video will reflect it. So this is New Amsterdam in 1660. Note the wall for Wall Street, right? So this is what Lower Manhattan looked like in 1660. Now I'm going to move myself back over again. 1664, under attack. So the English decide they want to have New Amsterdam, and they attack the Dutch, and the Dutch surrender, and that surrender and the turnover of New Amsterdam to the English to become New York, that took place down here in Lower Manhattan, that transaction. The settlement, as I said, became New York. Okay, switching gears now, because again, we have all these different threads happening this week. Now I want to turn to talk about Catholics, not in Maryland, but Catholics in South America, especially courtesy of the Jesuits. North America, in Canada. So we have Jesuits playing a big role here. We have Jesuits, the Jesuit English priest, Father Andrew White, who helped found Maryland. You're going to experience in a poem a little bit of reflection about the Jesuits in French, what is now French Canada. And you're going to watch the film The Mission, that has to do with Jesuit reducciones in South America. So this is an image of the founder of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius Loyola, the man himself. In 1540, okay, this is in Europe, back in Europe, before the 1600s and all of these Western European countries coming over to the Americas. The Society of Jesus, aka the Jesuits, was founded by St. Ignatius Loyola of the former picture and his followers. They are the ancestral founders of Fordham University. They founded this order in Europe in the midst of the Protestant Reformation, that big conflict, all of that upheaval, all of that violence. In 1549, the first Jesuit missionaries, so the Jesuits lost no time, they formed and then out they went, missionary order. They arrived in Brazil, sent by the Portuguese King Yao II. In 1587, the Jesuits arrive in the area of present-day Paraguay, and this is the setting for the film The Mission. And in that region, they begin to gather the Guarani, the indigenous people, into what they called reducciones, or reductions, or villages. So they set up these little communities in that region. It's a very tropical region. You'll see it in the film. In 1611, the French Jesuit missionaries, aka the Black Robes, they arrive in North America at what is now Port Royal, Canada. So we've got a lot of things happening here with the Jesuits. So let's take a look now at this map. Here we're now dealing with Central and South America, and we are looking at Spanish and Portuguese settlement. This map is really wonderful. It gives you where the Aztecs were located, and the Aztecs and the Inca, and also the different kinds of resources that were either extracted or cultivated in these regions by the processes of colonization and settlement. So I'm afraid some of this stuff will get, again, okay, what did I say here? This is the Spanish and Portuguese settlements from 1492 to 1750. I'm going to move this back up. Again, I don't know if that's reflected on your video. So let's go through this. In 1492, we know this, Columbus here in Hispaniola. 1496, Santo Domingo in the current Dominican Republic was settled. In 1509, Jamaica. 1511, Cuba. 1512, Mexico City in Puerto Rico. 1515, Havana in Cuba. 1519, Veracruz and Panama. 1522, Granada. 1524, Santiago. 1532, Cartagena. 1534, Cusco in Quito. 1535, Lima and Recife. 1536, Buenos Aires. 1537, Asuncion. 1542, Mérida. 1545, Potosí. 1547, Zacatecas. 1549, Bahia. 1550, Acapulco. 1565, Rio de Janeiro. 1567, Caracas. 1579, Monterrey. Wow, this is like all within less than 100 years. So fast. So fast did the Spanish and Portuguese arrive and settle and make their imprint upon this region. And you can see the different tobacco, stones, sugar, gold, mining, sugar, coffee. So precious minerals and stimulants, by and large. So now I want to show you a contemporary map of Central and South America so you can place it on your current imagination. So all of those regions that we just saw as settlements, colonial settlements, now this is how it looks today. So this is a painting here. We're moving back here briefly, not in South America, but flipping up to North America and to what is now French Canada, French-speaking Canada. And this is a painting of Père Marquette, Father Marquette, and the Indians, so the probably the Huron people, again imagined in the late 19th century. So you can see again another Jesuit in his famous black robe. And this has to do with the poem Praying Spoils the Hunting by Margaret M. Bruchac. This is a very short poem, but it's a very interesting one, and it plays well into the themes of this course. It refers to the relations between the Algonquins and the Black Robes of New France, so the Black Robes of the Jesuits of New France, or what we now call Canada. If you're interested to know more about the settlement of this region and the way that religion takes place in this moment of contact and colonialism, check out Bruce Beresford's 1991 motion picture called Black Robe. You have it, it's free, it's on Swank Database and Fordham Libraries, and for some of you it might be a really great idea for one of your Religion in America presentation projects. Briefly in the poem, Bruchac mentions an Indian or an indigenous woman who was converted to Catholicism and is now known as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, Gaderi Degaquita. This is an image of her. This is a stained glass window in Chesapeake, Virginia, at St. Stephen Martyr Church. It's quite beautiful. And I'm going to move this back up, though, and block off some of that gorgeous window. So, Gaderi, she is known, she was Algonquin and Mohawk, and her family was struck in the great smallpox disease of 1661 to 1663 that decimated the Mohawk people. The Europeans brought disease to the native peoples. Measles, smallpox, influenza, and decimated populations with disease. So Guderi lost her parents, and her face was scarred with pockmarks from smallpox. But at 19 years old, she was baptized, and she left her village to live in a Jesuit Indian Christian village near Montreal along the St. Lawrence River, and took a vow of perpetual virginity. At 24 years old, she died, quite young. But witnesses claim that minutes after her death, her face was transformed and it was radiant and beautiful. This was a miracle. And she was canonized as a Roman Catholic saint in 2012. The Bouchard poem refers to I can say Guderi, but I always get messed up with the correct pronunciation of Degagwita. Okay, so that was Guderi, and now let's move on to some thoughts about the feature film, The Mission, starring Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. This huge waterfall, this is the Iguazu Falls, now in Argentina and Brazil shared, and the film is it takes place in this region. It's some spectacular footage of the falls. The Mission, it was 1986, long time ago, by the filmmaker Roland Joffre, and the soundtrack is by Ennio Morricone. The soundtrack is quite impressive, even today. So it's a story about the Jesuit reducciones in that region, what's known as Paraguay now. The reductions or villages, that's a translation of reducciones. They were established in the early 17th century, and they were settlements for indigenous people, the Guarani, in the Rio Grande do Sul area of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. All of those current countries now intersect in that region that the film takes place in. The Jesuits tried in that region to create a, quote, state within a state, end quote. Native peoples in the reductions, guided by Jesuits, would be autonomous from Spanish colonists and Spanish rule. So it was a Spanish colony, but different laws and different rules applied to the folks that lived in the reducciones. Their bosses were the Jesuits, and they set up a very distinctive kind of intentional community there. Many Guarani came to the reductions to avoid enslavement and forced labor, so life was better in the reductions. And they became economically successful, and you'll see evidence of this in the film. However, in 1750, so we've now moved, we've talked about 1500s, 1600s, now we're in the mid-1700s. The Treaty of Madrid took place again, back overseas, back across the Atlantic, over in Spain, signed between Spain and Portugal, and it drew new borders in the colonial region that ceded part of Jesuit Paraguay from Spain to Portugal. And with that drawing of new borders, new rules applied. It forced a dislocation of the Jesuit reducciones, and there were violent uprisals as a result. The Mission is very much about this moment. In the Mission, we also get hints of the increasing pressure that was taking place in Europe in the 1700s upon the Jesuit order itself. So all of these items here are part of the context of what happens in the film The Mission. This image here is an image of the expulsion here, not of the Jews, not of the Muslims, but of the Jesuits from Spain, 1767. The order had become too powerful, too threatening to certain people who were also powerful, and so that was it, out. So they were expelled from Spain in 1767. Spain suppresses the order itself, and as a result, the Jesuits are expelled from the Guarani missions overseas. In 1773, the Roman Pope, the Society of Jesus, takes a special vow to the Pope, but under pressure, the Roman Pope dissolves the society, and it doesn't reemerge until after all of the Napoleonic Wars. So, finishing up, Unit 2. We're dealing with European state and economic interests and how they intersect in the contact in the colonialism and commitment in the Americas. How European religious disputes, especially between different Christianities and Jews, manifest themselves on the shores of the Americas. And multiple colonization of the Americas by the Spanish, Portuguese, English, Dutch, French, but not Swedish, but I don't say much about that. The spread of disease with Gadari, Gadakwita, and the influence of capitalism, the advances in science, technology, and navigation, resource extraction, and labor exploitation, and what that means in these new colonies. And we're asking, how do human dramas, especially when intersecting with religious commitment, how do they play out against this landscape beset by this whirlwind of forces? And so those are questions we are seeking to answer.